The stars had always called to them, for as long as anyone could remember, humans had looked up at the night sky and dreamed of going there. They built rockets, they sent probes, they walked on their moon, and then after centuries of trying, they finally built ships that could travel between the stars. It was the greatest moment in human history, or so they thought. The first contact happened quietly. A conclave patrol ship intercepted the human vessel Endurance near the outer edge of what the galactic maps called the neutral corridor. The human crew had spent 3 years traveling. To this point, they had carried with them gifts, translated greetings in 40 different known alien languages, and a message of peace recorded by every living head of state on Earth. They had prepared for this moment their whole lives. The patrol ship did not fire on them. It did something worse. It stopped, scanned them for exactly 11 seconds, and then a cold mechanical voice came through the communication system. The voice said that human vessels were not permitted in conclave space. It said that Earth had been classified under Provision 9 of the Interstellar Conduct Treaty as a pre-civilized threat species. It said the Endurance had 48 hours to return to its point of origin. Then the patrol ship turned and left. Without another word, Commander Sierra Voss stood at the viewport and watched it go. She was 53 years old. She had spent 30 years training for this mission. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and said nothing for a long time. Behind her, the crew was silent too. Someone in the back of the room cried very quietly, and nobody told them to stop. The message they sent home took 6 months to arrive. When it did, it broke something in the world below. People had expected rejection before, of course. Philosophers and scientists had warned that contact might go badly, but there is a difference between knowing something might happen and feeling it happen. The news spread from continent to continent in hours, on every screen. In every language, people read the same words: per-civilized threat species, 48 hours to leave. The governments of Earth held emergency sessions. There was anger. Naturally, some leaders called for military responses, though no one could seriously say what that would look like against a civilization that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, longer than humans had been writing. Others called for diplomacy, for patience, for more attempts at contact. A few said nothing at all, snorts, because they did not know what to say. But the conclave had not finished. 3 months after the Endurance was turned away, a second message arrived at Earth's deep space relay stations. It was longer this time, and it was formal. The conclave had voted, all 47 member species, and the vote had not been close. Humanity was to be placed under quarantine. No human ship was to be permitted beyond a boundary they called the marker line, a ring of monitoring buoys placed just far enough from Earth's solar system that humans could see them through powerful telescopes, tiny silver glints in the dark that said, "This far and no further." The message explained the reasoning. Humanity had a history of violence that spanned its entire recorded existence, wars by the thousands, weapons capable of destroying cities in seconds, a pattern of expanding into new territories and consuming resources without care for what was already there. The conclave had observed Earth for 200 years before making contact, watching through their long-range instruments, and what they had seen did not reassure them. The message said with the calm certainty of something written by bureaucrats who had never met a human being in person, that the risk of allowing such a species access to interstellar travel was unacceptable. What the message did not mention, and what Voss would think about for many years afterward, was that the conclave had not asked, they had not sent an ambassador, they had not opened a dialogue, they had not looked at a hospital being built in a war-damaged city, or a group of strangers pulling survivors from rubble, or the millions of ordinary people who spent their lives trying to make things a little better than they found them. They had watched from a distance and made their decision from the parts that were easiest to see. Vass was called back to Earth on the next available ship. She spent the long journey writing a report that nobody seemed to know what to do with. When she finally landed and stood in front of the Joint Committee of the World Assembly, she told them what she had seen and what she had felt. She told them about the 48 seconds between the patrol ship scan and its message, and how in that time she had hoped so fiercely that her hands had trembled. She told them about the silence on the ship afterward. She told them that the rejection had not felt like a political event. It had felt personal in the way that all real rejections do. She also told them something else. On the last night before the Endurance turned around to head home, she had been alone in the communications room running one final check of all frequencies when she heard something. It was not a clear signal. It was not in any of the 40 languages she had prepared. It was barely a signal at all, more like a pattern in the background noise, the kind of thing you would dismiss as interference unless you had been listening very carefully for a very long time. But Voss had spent 3 years in deep space, and she had learned to listen. She played the recording for the committee. Most of them heard nothing. One old scientist in the 3rd row sat forward in her chair and asked Voss to play it again. Voss played it again. The scientist asked for it a 3rd time, and this time she closed her eyes while she listened. When she opened them, she said that it was not random. She said there was a structure to it. She said it looked just barely like someone trying not to be noticed while they waved. The committee did not know what to do with that either. They thanked Voss for her service and told her they would be in contact. She walked out of the building into a gray afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment, looking up at a sky full of cloud. Somewhere behind those clouds, past the blue edge of the atmosphere, past the moon, past the cold outer planets, the marker line buoy sat in their silent ring. The galaxy had told humanity it was not welcome. It had done so politely, professionally, with the full weight of 47 civilizations behind the decision. And yet someone somewhere out there in all that dark had sent a signal so faint you could almost believe it was not there at all. Vice went home. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table with the recording playing softly from her tablet, and she listened to it over and over until she could hear the shape of it in her mind. Even when the room was quiet, she did not know who had sent it. She did not know what it meant. She did not know if it was hope or a mistake, but she kept it, and she kept listening. On Earth the people carried on as they always did. The markets opened, the schools filled with children, the hospitals stayed lit. Through the night people argued and fell in love and built things and broke things and helped their neighbors when they could and failed to when they could not. The marker line sat in the sky. Above them all, invisible to the naked eye, a border drawn by strangers who had decided from a great distance who they were. They had not asked the humans what they thought about that, and the humans, for now, had no way to make them listen. But that would not always be true. Nobody told Captain Darren Osai to go into the Vale. That was perhaps the most important thing about it. He had not been ordered there. No committee had approved the route. No official mission plan included the stretch of dark, unmapped space that sat just beyond the marker line's eastern edge, a region so full of dense gas clouds and dead stars that most long-range instruments could not see more than a few light minutes into it. The conclave had no presence there. Nobody did, which was exactly why Ase thought it was worth a look. He was not a reckless man. He had commanded survey vessels for 16 years, and he had survived all of them because he was careful in the way that only people who love the job can be. He checked his instruments twice, trusted his crew completely, and never went anywhere without a solid reason. His reason that time was simple. If the conclave had quarantined humanity from their space, then humanity would need to find space of its own. The Vale was unclaimed. That made it in theory available. The ship he took was called the Reed. It was small, built for speed and quiet rather than combat, and it carried a crew of 11. They crossed the marker line at a point where the monitoring buoys were spaced the farthest apart, not because Ase was trying to sneak past them, but because he saw no reason to make a scene. They entered the Vale on a Tuesday morning. Ship time with a full tank, 3 months of supplies, and no idea what they were going to find. For the first 2 weeks, they found nothing. Gas clouds in the cold, remnants of old stars, some so ancient they had collapsed into dense little points of light that pulled at the ship's sensors like something quietly calling. The crew mapped everything, cataloged everything, sent data back to Earth in long compressed bursts. It was good work, steady work, the kind of work that fills the hours without drama. Oi liked it. Some of the younger crew members found it dull. He let them complain. It was their right. On the 15th day, they found the wreckage. It was spread across nearly 200,000 km of empty space, so old that most of it had tumbled into dust, but some pieces remained. Structural members of some kind of large station made from a metal alloy that none of them could identify. Fragments of what might have been hull plating, shaped in curves that no human engineer had designed, and deeper in, partially hidden behind a dead moon's shadow, the ghost of something that had once been a settlement. A few sealed chambers still held atmosphere. Nothing breathed inside them anymore. But on the walls, something had drawn pictures. Ase put on a suit and went in himself. He spent 2 hours in there, moving slowly with a lamp, looking at the walls. The pictures were simple, the way all pictures made by intelligent hands are simple when the hands are gone, and only the pictures remain. Shapes that might have been places, figures that might have been people, lines connecting things, showing movement or relationship or time. He did not know what they meant, but he understood with a certainty that had nothing to do with science, that someone had put them there because they wanted to be remembered. When he came back out, his crew was quiet around him. The youngest member of the team, a navigator named Cho, asked who they had been. Ase said he did not know. He said the conclave's historical records, the ones that human researchers had been able to access before the quarantine made no mention of a civilization in this region, he said. That either they had been missed or they had been forgotten on purpose, neither answer was comfortable. They kept going deeper into the veil, and 3 days later, they found the living. The first sign was a power signature, faint and irregular, like something running on not quite enough fuel. O brought the read slowly with all external lights dimmed and communications broadcasting greeting on every frequency they had. They came around the far side of a gas cloud, and there it was, a cluster of small ships, none larger than the reed herself, lashed together at odd angles, with cables and makeshift connectors, drifting slowly against the dark backdrop of the nebula. The ships were old. They looked like they had been repaired many times with pieces that did not quite match being pressed into service. Anyway, for 20 minutes nothing happened. Ase sat in the captain's chair and waited. He had a gift for patience that his crew admired and occasionally found infuriating. He simply waited because whoever was in those ships had every reason to be afraid, and fear needs time. Then a panel opened on the nearest vessel, and a figure appeared in the frame. It was roughly the height of a tall human, but the similarity ended there. 6 limbs, the top 4 functioning as arms, the bottom 2 as legs, a body covered in something between skin and shell, pale and rigged, a head that was wider than it was tall, with eyes on the sides that could see almost all the way around. Figure stood very still in the opening and looked at the reed with those wide eyes. Asa raised his hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. Slowly, with the air of something that had learned long ago not to trust sudden movements, the figure raised one of its upper limbs back. It took 3 days to establish basic communication, working through gesture and pattern, and eventually the translation software that the Earth's xenolinguistics teams had built in the years since first contact. The beings called themselves in their own language, something that translated most closely as those who remained. Ase's crew began calling them the Vhersi, which was an approximation of the sound of their own name for their species. The Vhersi did not seem to mind. Their story came out slowly in pieces, the way any story does when it is painful and the teller is not sure yet if the listener is safe. 200 years ago, the Vhersi had been a conclave member species. They had been small but stable, a civilization of quiet scientists and artists who lived on a handful of worlds in a sector of space that had little strategic value. When the conclave entered one of its periodic wars, the Vhersi had refused to fight, not out of cowardice, their elder explained to Ase through the translator, but because they had a philosophical and spiritual tradition that forbade the taking of life for political purposes. They had offered instead to serve as healers, as neutral caretakers of the wounded from any side. The conclave had decided that was not enough. They had been given an ultimatum: contribute to the war effort or lose their membership. The Vhersi had chosen their principles over their membership, and so they had been expelled, their world stripped of conclave protection, their name removed from the official histories. Some had been absorbed by neighboring species under various arrangements that the elder described with a careful blankness that suggested they had not been good arrangements. The ones who remained free had gathered what ships they could and gone into the unmapped dark They had been hiding for 200 years. They knew things the elders said quietly. They had kept records, maintained their traditions, raised their children on the stories of what they had been, but they were few now and tired, and they had long since stopped believing that anyone outside the veil would ever find them, let alone sit with them and listen. On the third night, Asse's crew shared their own food with the Vihersi, human food, strange and probably strain, tasting to beings whose biochemistry was different in a dozen ways that the ship's doctor was still working out, but the act of sharing mattered more than the food itself. The Vihersi elder sat across from Asse in the reed small common room, and they ate together, and the translator hummed softly between them. The elder said after a long silence, "You sit with us. No one has sat with us in a very long time." Asse thought about that. He thought about the endurance being turned away at the neutral corridor, about the 47 species who had voted without asking, about the marker line sitting in Earth sky like a scar. He thought about the drawings on the walls of the dead settlement, and the hands that had made them, and the hope that had put them there. He told the elder that he understood something about being told you did not belong. The elder's wide eyes regarded him steadily. Then the elder made a sound that the translator, after a moment, rendered as, "Perhaps that is why you came." Word began to spread through the veil. It moved the way all news moves in hidden places, slowly and carefully, and with great care taken about who could be trusted. A human ship had come into the unmapped dark. It had not come armed. It had not come with demands. It had come with food and a hand raised in greeting. And when it found the ones who had been forgotten, it had sat down with them and listened. Nobody knew quite what to make of that, but they were paying attention. No one had planned for Station Hearth to become what it became. That was the truth that its founders, if you could call them that, always told when people asked. There had been no grand vision, no committee meeting where someone stood up and said, "Let us build a refuge for the lost." There had only been a problem in front of them and a decision about whether to look away from it. The station had started as a resupply point. When the reed returned from the veil and the reports spread through the human space agencies, a small group of engineers and diplomats had proposed placing a permanent human structure just inside the unmapped region, a fixed point where the fringe could be reached without crossing the marker line. The World Assembly had approved it in a narrow vote, less because they were excited about it and more because they could not think of a strong enough reason to say no. Construction took 14 months. The first crew of 400 arrived to find a functional but bare facility, all utility and no warmth, the kind of place that said, "We are here," without saying anything about why. The Vihersi had come first naturally. A small group of their ships had followed the reed home at a careful distance, not quite committing, watching. When the station was finished and the lights were on, they docked cautiously on the outer ring and asked through Asse's translator if they were allowed to stay. Nobody had thought to prepare an answer to that question. Asse looked at the station commander, a practical woman named Finn Adami, and she looked at him, and then she looked at the Vihersi elder, who was watching them both with patient wide eyes. Adame said, "Yes, of course, stay as long as you need." The word spread as it had spread before, snorts in the fringe, in the unmapped dark among the exiled and the expelled, and the ones who had lost their worlds through politics or war or the quiet violence of simply being inconvenient to more powerful neighbors. The word spread. There was a place, it was human, it did not ask questions at the door. They came in ones and twos at first, then in small ships, then in anything that could hold atmosphere and move. A species called the drowned, beetle-shaped and deeply shy, who had been stripped of their home system after refusing to pay a tithe to a conclave military coalition, a small group of mixed species refugees who had survived the collapse of a fringe colony and had nowhere recognized to go. Individual beings of a dozen different kinds who had been separated from their people by circumstances too complicated and too sad to summarize quickly. They all came to here in Hearth because Adami had said yes without thinking too hard about the long-term logistics. Let them all in. Within 18 months the station held 4,000 people from 7 different species. Within 3 years it held 40,000 from 11. The original 400 humans found themselves a small minority in a place that was still technically theirs, a strange and not entirely comfortable position that most of them adjusted to with varying degrees of grace. There were problems because of course. There were language problems, food problems, temperature and atmosphere problems, cultural misunderstandings that sometimes boiled over into something louder and more difficult. To drown were badly frightened by a human who moved too quickly in a corridor and did not realize this until afterward. A VHC elder stopped eating for a week because the smells from the human kitchen section made her physically ill. Heated argument over access to the outer docking ring went on for 11 days before anyone managed to resolve it, but they resolved it. That was the thing that kept surprising people who watched from a distance. The humans of Hearth seemed to have an unusual tolerance for being uncomfortable, for sitting with a problem that had no clean answer and working at it until something better emerged. They did not always succeed. There were failures too, things that were never quite fixed, tensions that settled into a low background hum rather than disappearing entirely. But the overall movement was always towards something that worked, even when that something was messy and imperfect and smelled strange and required everyone to make compromises they had not expected to make. Back on Earth, not everyone was pleased. The World Assembly's governing council had been receiving regular reports from Hearth, and the reports, while not alarming, were the kind that made budget committees deeply nervous. Resources were being stretched. The station had been built for 400 and was now holding 40,000. The life support systems were being upgraded in stages, never quite fast enough. Food synthesis units ran 22 hours a day. Medical facilities handled species they had never been designed for, with doctors improvising treatments from first principles and a great deal of careful guesswork. A faction of council members began pushing for what they called a more structured intake process. What they meant, if you listened carefully to the longer version of their arguments, was that Hearth should stop letting everyone in and start making choices about who qualified. They framed it in practical language, in words about sustainability and capacity and responsible management. The arguments were not unreasonable. Taken on their own terms, the station genuinely could not go on expanding indefinitely without resources to match The debate reached its highest point during a council session in the fourth year of Hearth's operation. A young counselor named Priya Rallo had been listening to the sustainability arguments for 3 days. She was from a city that had been partially destroyed in a flood when she was 9 years old, and she remembered the relief convoys arriving, and she remembered how the people who drove those convoys had not stopped at the edge of the damaged district to assess which houses were worth saving. She stood up and waited for the room to be quiet. She said that she understood the resource concerns. She said she shared them and that they needed to be addressed, and she was willing to work on that. But she said there was a question underneath the resource question that they needed to answer honestly before they talked about intake structures. She said the question was this: when they had been rejected by the conclave, when the marker line had gone up and 47 species had voted them out, what had hurt the most? She waited for an answer, though she did not really expect one. Then she said it was the door closing, not the politics. The door, she said. We know what it feels like to knock and hear nothing. We will not become that silence. The motion to restrict intake failed. It was not the last time it would be raised, but it failed that day, and the council instead approved a significant increase in resources allocated to HFY's expansion. It was not enough, not immediately, and the station would continue to strain for years, but it would not close its door. A few months after that vote, something happened that nobody on the council had planned for. A conclave intelligence vessel was detected in the space near Hearth, running quiet, watching. This was technically illegal under the same treaties that had placed the marker line around Earth, though the conclave tended to interpret its own rules generously. A security team tracked the vessel for 3 days before it became clear that it knew it had been spotted and was waiting to see what Hearth would do. What Hearth did surprised everyone, including Adami. A small crew took a shuttle out to the intelligence vessel, pulled alongside it, and broadcast a simple message: we have seen you watching. If you want to look, come inside. We will show you around. Intelligence vessel did not respond for 6 hours. Then it docked. The conclave agent who came out was a being of a species that the humans had no name for. Small and careful, moving with the look of someone who had been in hidden places for a very long time. Adami met him personally and gave him a tour of the station, all of it, the overcrowded medical wing, the improvised atmosphere, sections where the drowned lived in conditions slightly different from the rest, the common spaces where 11 species shared meals in a noise and variety that was sometimes chaos and sometimes something closer to music. The children's section where small beings of half a dozen kinds played together with the uncomplicated ease of people who had not yet learned enough about the galaxy to know they were supposed to be enemies. The agent said very little during the tour. When it was over, Adami offered him food. He ate it. When his shuttle left 6 hours later, he took with him a data package that Adami had prepared in advance. Hearth's complete public records, its population figures, its resource requests, its medical logs, everything open and unedited. He returned to the conclave and filed his report. They did not share the contents of that report with Hearth. But in the months that followed, something shifted, almost too subtle to notice at first, in the tone of the official communications that occasionally still passed between The conclave's border stations and Earth relay systems, the language, became very slightly less cold. On Hearth, nobody noticed. They were too busy fixing the life support systems in Section 7 and arguing about the docking schedule and figuring out how to grow HFY grain in a hydroponic bay that had been designed for Earth vegetables, and all the 10,000 other small necessary things that it took to keep 40,000 lives running in a space that had been built for 400. The HFY elder who had been on Hearth since the beginning watched all of this from her favorite spot near a viewport in the outer ring. She watched the ships come in. She watched the people fill the corridors. She had spent 200 years hiding in the dark, and she was old enough to know that what she was watching was something that did not happen often in the galaxy. She did not have a word for it in her own language, but she thought the humans might be right to call it home. The ultimatum arrived on a Thursday. Nobody on Hearth found out until Friday because it was sent to Earth's World Assembly first, and the Assembly spent 24 hours reading it very carefully and arguing about what it meant before passing it along. By Saturday morning, Ademi had it in front of her on a screen in her office, and she read it 3 times before she called anyone else in. The conclave's message was long, formal, and wrapped in the kind of diplomatic language that takes great effort to write and even greater effort to fully understand, but the center of it was simple. The conclave had been observing Station Hearth for some time, as Adami knew. Snorts, what had started as a human resupply point, had become something they considered a destabilizing presence. The fringe, numerous species under various forms of conclave obligation had made contact with Hearth. Some had defied direct conclave instructions in order to do so. The station represented in the conclave's view an unofficial human expansion into space that humanity had been legally prohibited from entering. The message said that the conclave was prepared to impose a full economic blockade on Earth if Hearth was not dismantled within 90 days, not reduced, not restructured, dismantled. Ademi called Ase first. He was on Earth at the time in a meeting about the next survey rotation into the Veil, and he stepped out of the room to take her call. She read him the relevant section. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "They want us to send 40,000 people." Where? That was the question. Nobody. The World Assembly seemed to have a clean answer for. The beings living on Hearth had in many cases nowhere else to go. The HFY had no recognized home territory. The drowned system was under conclave administration with conditions attached that made return effectively impossible. The mixed species refugees from the collapsed fringe colony had a legal status that the conclave's treaty framework did not even have a category for. Dismantling the station did not mean sending them home. It meant sending them into the dark again. The Assembly debated for 2 weeks. There were voices for compliance, serious and thoughtful voices making serious and thoughtful points about the realities of economic blockade and what it would mean for 8 billion people on Earth. Humanity was not self-sufficient in all areas. Certain medical compounds, certain rare materials used in deep space drive components, certain data systems they had acquired through indirect trade with conclave-adjacent species during the years of relative quiet, all of that could be cut off. The consequences would not be immediate, but they would be real, and they would be felt by people who had nothing to do with the station or the decisions that had led to this moment. Counselor Ralph listened to all of it. She had been listening to the arguments for and against compliance for 2 weeks, and she understood every one of them. On the 14th day, she stood up and said that she needed to go to Hearth. Before she could vote, the assembly gave her 3 days. She took a fast transport and arrived at the station in 36 hours. She spent 2 days walking through it. She ate in the common areas and sat in the medical wing and watched the children play in the section that had been built for them last year, which was already too small and had a waiting list for the after-school programs because there were more children than had been expected. She talked to people, not in formal meetings, not an organized tour, just in corridors and eating areas and the small garden section near the inner ring where someone had managed to grow actual plants in the artificial light. She talked to a VHRC woman who had been born on the station, the first of her kind to be born anywhere other than in the Vale in living memory. She talked to a drowned engineer who had redesigned half of Hearth's water recycling system and was currently working on something that might solve the atmosphere problem in Section 12. On her last evening, she sat with a daimie in the commander's office, with the viewport open to the stars. They drank tea, which Adami had found a way to grow in the station's garden section, and they talked for a long time about things that were not directly related to the problem in front of them, which was itself a kind of talking about the problem. Ralph flew back and cast her vote. The assembly's decision was not unanimous, but it was clear Hearth would not be dismantled. The response was sent to the conclave with careful language and without apology. It acknowledged the concerns. It offered to discuss formal frameworks and mutual obligations. It said that humanity was willing to talk about almost anything. It said that the people of Hearth were not a bargaining piece. The 90 days ran out on a morning when the station was having one of its better days, all systems running, the docking schedule on time, the common areas full of the particular noise that means a community is alive. A daimie was in the command center when the long rain sensors showed it, a conclave armada moving into the space outside the Vale's edge, not 1 or 2 patrol ships, an armada, 30 vessels of various sizes, the largest of them a class of ship that the human databases identified as a fleet anchor, the kind of vessel that did not travel alone and was not sent to have conversations. The crew in the command center was very quiet. Adam looked at her screen and counted the ships. Then she looked up and said in a voice that was steady, because she had decided it would be, "Get me a channel to the outer docking ring." What happened next was not something she had arranged. It was not something anyone had arranged, which was the point. Over the previous weeks, as the situation had become clearer to everyone who lived and worked at Hearth, the beings of the station had talked among themselves in the way that communities do when they feel that something important is coming and they want to decide together what they believe. The VHRC elder had called a gathering of her people. The drowned had held their own council, a long, quiet affair conducted in near darkness because that was how they thought best. Others had talked in smaller groups in corridors and eating areas in the garden section. Nobody had told them to. Nobody had organized it. The result of all that talking was parked in Hearth's outer docking ring, When the Conclave Armada appeared, 12 V-Hersey ships, their hulls patched and old, but their navigation systems recently upgraded with help from Hearth's engineering team, 8 drown freighters reconfigured with weapon mounts that had taken 3 months to build, and that the drown engineers were not entirely sure would work, but they had decided that was less important than the fact of having them. 4 other vessels from 3 other species, each one there, because someone had made a choice about where they stood. Owie was back at Hearth. By then, he stood beside a Damie in the command center and watched the combined fleet emerge from the outer ring. It was not an impressive fleet by any military standard. It was battered and mismatched, and probably outgunned by the Conclave Armada by a significant factor, but it was there. Ambassador Voss, who was 71 years old now and had returned to Hearth 2 months earlier when the situation began to escalate, asked for the command Cent's main communications channel. Adami gave it to her without hesitation. Voss stood in front of the transmitter and looked at the screen, and then she looked at her own hands for a moment, and then she began. She said to the Conclave Admiral commanding the Armada, "I know what you see when you look at us. You see a species you quarantined because you were afraid of what we might become. You saw our history and you made a judgment that was not entirely without reason. We have done terrible things. We know this. We do not ask you to forget it." She paused. The channel was open and the Armada was listening, and the whole station was listening too, through the internal feeds, every corridor and eating area and medical bay and children's section full of beings waiting to hear what came next. She said, "But look at who is standing beside us, not because we paid them or threatened them or promised them something we could not deliver. Look at who came, and ask yourself what that means about what we are." The Armada did not fire. The silence after Voss stopped speaking lasted long enough that several people in the command center stopped breathing without noticing. Then the Conclave Admiral opened a return channel. She did not speak immediately either. When she did, she said only that the Armada would hold its position pending further instruction from the Conclave Governing Council. Then she closed the channel. It was not a victory exactly. It was the moment before a victory, which is its own kind of thing. The Armada sat in space outside the Veil's edge and did not advance. On the station, 40,000 beings breathed in and breathed out and waited. 2 days later, a message came from the Conclave Council itself. Not an ultimatum this time, a request. The Council, the message said, would like to send a delegation to Station Hearth for a formal meeting. They proposed a date 3 weeks away. They asked if this would be acceptable. Damie read the message twice, then she sent back a single line. "Yes, the delegation is welcome. We will prepare a place for them." She set down the communicator and looked out the viewport at the stars for a long time. Somewhere behind her in the station, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the place. Running footsteps, voices in half a dozen languages, the low hum of the atmosphere systems, the distant clatter of the engineering team doing something complicated in Section 12, 40,000 people going about the business of being alive. She thought, let them come. Let them see it. The Conclave delegation arrived on a morning when Station Hearth smelled like bread. This was not planned. The human bakers in the common area of the Inner ring had simply decided that morning was a good morning for baking. And the ventilation system, as it always did, carried the smell through about a third of the station before anyone could have done anything about it. Adame noticed it when she was walking down the main corridor toward the docking bay and thought briefly about whether it was the kind of first impression she wanted to make on a formal diplomatic delegation. Then she thought about it for another second and decided she did not mind at all. There were 9 of them. 7 members of the conclave governing council representing 7 different species and 2 staff members who stayed slightly behind and carried things. They came out of the docking collar in a careful line, wearing formal ceremonial dress that was elaborate and various, and in 3 cases involved structures on their heads that made passing through doorways an interesting challenge. Adame met them at the entrance to the main corridor with Vas beside her, and Asa stepped back and they exchanged greetings in the formal way with all the correct phrases on both sides delivered in the correct order. Then the lead delegate, the senior council elder, being of a species called the Ethari, whose people had been among the first to vote for the quarantine 30 years ago, looked past Adame down the length of the corridor. It was a busy morning. People were moving through it in both directions, beings of 11 different kinds, going about the ordinary business of a station that had too much to do and not quite enough time to do all of it. A pair of VHRC teenagers moved past, quickly chattering in their own language. A drone engineer walked by, carrying a piece of equipment under 4 of its 6 arms, nodding briefly at Adame as it passed. 2 human children ran by in the other direction and were called back by their parent in a voice that was more tired than angry. The senior elder watched all of this for a moment, then she said to Adame, "May we walk?" They walked for 3 hours. This was not what the official schedule had called for. The official schedule had meetings and presentations and a formal lunch. All of that was set aside by unspoken agreement because the elder had asked to walk and Adame had said yes, and the rest of the delegation followed without objection. They went through the common areas and the medical wing and the engineering sections and the garden, which had grown considerably since Ralph had last visited and now took up most of what had once been a storage bay. They went to the children's section and stood quietly in the doorway while small beings of 6 different species learned how to draw pictures of stars from a human teacher who had been at Hearth since the beginning and had adapted her curriculum to include with varying success the aesthetic traditions of every culture represented in her classroom. They went to the outer ring where the viewport looked out at the stars and you could see, if you knew where to look, the very faint glint of the marker line buoy. Sitting in the far distance, the elder stood at the viewport for a long time. Without speaking, Vas stood beside her, also without speaking, which was something she had become very good at over the years. After a while the elder said, "How many people live here now?" Adame said 43,000 as of this morning. The number changes. We had 6 arrivals last week. Someone is always coming, the elder said, and they all stay. Adame thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to answer questions. She said most of them, some leave when they can, when they find a safer place or a way back to something they lost, but most of them stay. They say it is because this is where they belong now. She paused and then said, I used to think that was a sad thing to say. I do not think that anymore. They had the formal lunch. It was held in the main common area rather than the conference room because the elder had asked for it. And the kitchen staff, which was by that point a cooperative effort involving cooks from 4 species, had prepared food that was technically edible by all 9 members of the delegation without causing harm, which was as much as could be promised. The lunch was noisy and imperfect, and at one point someone at a nearby table dropped something metal, which startled 2 of the delegates considerably, and Adame apologized, and the delegate who was startled said with a dignity that Adame found admirable, No, it is fine. It is a real place. The formal session happened in the afternoon. The delegation sat at one side of a long table in the conference room, and the humans sat at the other, with Voss at the center. There were prepared statements on both sides which were read out in full and received politely. There were questions and clarifications and long technical passages about treaty frameworks and jurisdictional definitions that made everyone's eyes go slightly unfocused in the same way, regardless of species. Then the elder set aside the prepared documents and looked at Voss directly and said, "We would like to offer humanity full membership in the galactic conclave. The classification of privileged threat species will be formally rescinded. The marker line will be removed within 90 days of your acceptance. You will have access to all conclave systems, trade networks, and diplomatic frameworks on the same terms as any full member." She said it as if it were a simple thing, as if 30 years had not passed, as if the endurance had not been turned away at the neutral corridor, and Voss had not stood at the viewport watching it go. Voss was quiet for a long moment. The room was very still. Then she said, "Thank you, we accept." And then she said, without raising her voice or changing her tone, "We have one condition." The elder waited. Voss said, "The species represented at this station, the V. Horsey, the Drown, and the others who have been living in the fringe without recognized status, they receive full conclave membership simultaneously. The same terms, no conditions attached, and no waiting period, the same day as us, or we have more to discuss." The elder was quiet for a moment. The 2 staff members behind her exchanged a look. Then the elder said, "That is a significant request." Voss said, "I know." There was a long pause. The elder turned and spoke quietly with the other members of the delegation, and voices too low to carry across the table. It went on for several minutes. Adame, watching from her seat, kept her face still and thought about the 43,000 people living and working on the other side of the conference room walls, and she waited. The elder turned back. She said, "It can be done." Formal signing took place the next morning. It was a long ceremony with many documents and many signatures in many forms, because 9 species have 9 different ways of making something official, and all of them had to be honored. Osai stood against the back wall and watched it happen. He thought about the reed crossing the marker line into the veil. He thought about the wreckage of the old settlement and the pictures on the walls, the hands that had put them there, the hope of being remembered. He thought about the V. Hersey elder saying, "You sit with us. No one has sat with us in a very long time." After the ceremony, there was a gathering in the common area that started as an official reception and turned within about an hour into Something considerably less formal. Someone started playing music which was complicated because the musical traditions present in the room were extremely varied, and what was pleasant to one species was occasionally bewildering to another. But they sorted it out by experiment and by listening, and by the second hour it had become something that was not quite any single tradition but was unmistakably the sound of people celebrating. The senior elder from the HFY found SciFiStories near the viewport in the late evening when the gathering had quieted somewhat and most of the delegation had retired to their quarters. She stood beside him and they both looked out at the stars. After a moment she said, "I was on the council 30 years ago when we voted for the quarantine. I was not yet the senior elder, but I was there. I voted yes." SciFiStories said, nothing waiting. She said, "We watched your history and we were afraid. We are still afraid of some of it. I think you know that. But I have spent today walking through this place and I find that I am more afraid of what it would have meant if we had never let you in at all." He thought about that. He thought about all the things he wanted to say, and then he said the simple one: most of us are just trying to do right by the people in front of us. We are not always good at it, but we try. The elder was quiet for a moment, then she said in a way that was almost to herself, "Perhaps that is rarer than it should be." In the morning, when the delegation ship departed and the station's daily routines resumed, O took over the command center for the early shift because Adame had finally agreed to sleep for more than 4 hours. He sat at the main console and watched the screens, the docking schedules, and the atmospheric readings, and the 100 small indicators that told him the station was alive and running. At the start of the second hour, the long range sensors flagged an incoming vessel. Unknown registration, hull markings that did not match any database they had on file, navigation lights functional but barely, the kind of glow that means a ship running on whatever was left. It was moving slowly toward the station's outer ring. Oy looked at it for a moment, then he reached over and opened the docking bay. He did not ask who they were or where they had come from or whether they had the right papers or what species they were or whether they had somewhere else they could go. He opened the bay because that was what you did when someone arrived. He had been doing it for years. It was a habit now, deep and quiet and entirely his own. Unknown ship drifted in the bay. Doors closed behind it, and somewhere in the station a new set of footsteps began making their way down a corridor that had been made for everyone, and that belonged now to whoever came through the door. That was how it had always worked at Hearth. That was how it would keep working. That was the human answer to galaxy that had once told them they were not welcome, not an argument, not a war, not a declaration. Just a door held open in the dark. "Come in, we have room."